The Opium Wars, a collision of civilizations and the cost of empire. The setting sun cast a warm, gold-colored glow over the busy harbor in Guangzhou, a bustling city in southern China, where merchants were hollering across the cacophony of the dockyards as their voices struggled to rise above the rhythmic creaks of the wood while the ships bobbed softly against the tide. The air was alive with activity. Porters loaded and unloaded crates full of precious cargo. Sailors exchanged gossip and laughter, and the smell of exotic spices and fragrant tea wafted through the narrow, crowded streets. It spoke of prosperity and life, a prospering hub of commerce joining China to the greater world. Yet beneath this lively veneer, dark clouds were gathering. Greed, power, and addiction were all combining in such a way as to alter the course of history forever. What seemed like just another day in Guangzhou was about to become the backdrop against which one of the most fateful and disastrous wars of the 19th century would unfold, the Opium Wars. This was more than a confrontation of armies, but a collision of civilizations, one that would leave scars for generations. Let us go back to the late 18th century, when England was in the grip of a very strange obsession. The object of its desire was tea. Those delicate leaves from China had crossed the threshold of being just a beverage and had become a cultural phenomenon, mushing through barriers of class and social separation. From refined British aristocratic drawing rooms to humble fireplaces in homes of working-class families, tea had become a part of daily life, a ritual for comfort, refinement, and even national identity. But this satisfaction came with a high price. The East India Company, a huge trading company controlling much of Britain's commerce with Asia, was obliged to import vast amounts of tea to satisfy public demand. Yet there was one big problem. The Chinese Qing dynasty was not interested in British goods. Their economy was self-sufficient and flourishing, and they regarded the Western world with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. To the Chinese, a trade with England was a one-sided affair. For silver, tea, nothing more. And this trade imbalance began to drain England's reserves of precious silver and created growing frustration and anxiety among British leaders. Faced with this challenge, British officials and merchants conceived a plan that would have far-reaching and catastrophic consequences. If they couldn't trade goods that China wanted, they would trade something China couldn't resist. The solution? Opium. Grown in the rich fields of British-controlled India, it was inexpensive to produce, light to transport, and horribly addictive. British traders, starting in the early 19th century, began smuggling large amounts of opium into China, in clear contravention of the stern bans placed upon the substance by the Qing dynasty. The results were all but instantaneous, all but apocalyptic. Addiction tore through Chinese society as if in a plague, burrowing into each echelon of life. Farmers abandoned their fields, artisans deserted their workshops, and communities that once were thriving fell into despair. Whole villages were being ruined by the strong grip of the drug, with families torn apart by the vicious cycle of dependency. Even worse, the silver that at one time had flowed into China in payment for tea was now bleeding out in exchange for opium, destabilizing the empire's economy and threatening its very foundation. The Chinese Emperor Daoguang was incensed. As the head of a vast and venerable empire, he was to regard this opium epidemic as more than a social crisis, a moral outrage, an affront to the very sovereignty of his nation. The emperor was determined to take immediate action and called upon Lin Zexu, a high-ranking official with a reputation for incorruptibility and unwavering resolve, to root out the opium trade. On arriving in Guangzhou, the hub of the opium trade, Lin did not waste any time. He took the British traders to task in no uncertain terms. He warned them in very strong words to hand over their stores of opium and give up their illegitimate trade. As words did not work, Lin adopted a bold, unparalleled measure. He seized over 1,200 tons of opium and, mixing it with lime, flushed the mixture into the sea. However, the clear signal that Lin had given the British marked the beginning of hostilities. Back in England, the response was immediate and angry. The British government, deep in the pocket of the East India Company and great merchants, declared that this was not only an attack on their trade, but also an affront to the principle of free trade itself. Beneath this justification, however, lay a cold and calculated ambition. Britain's leaders saw an opportunity not only to protect their economic interests, but also to expand their influence in Asia. When mobilized, it was the most feared military force then in the world. The British Navy would set sail to enforce all those British demands, should it be called upon. The First Opium War was started in 1839. Brutal and quite one-sided were its characteristics. The steam-powered gunboats, fitted out with improved armament, simply tore through the wooden Chinese ships along the coast in a devastating action. The Qing forces, armed with swords, spears, and outdated firearms, could not resist the British firepower in fight after fight. A particularly stark example was the capture of Canton, where a small British force of several hundred soldiers routed tens of thousands of Qing troops with minimal losses. Whole cities were bombarded, ports blockaded, and Chinese coastal defenses obliterated. To the Qing dynasty, it was a humiliation never experienced, a graphic demonstration of how far the empire had fallen behind the industrialized West. But this conflict wasn't just a war over opium or even trade. It was a clash of civilizations, a struggle between two vastly different worlds. Britain, with its industrial might and capitalist ambitions, represented a new global order driven by profit and expansion. While Confucian traditions were deeply ingrained into China's hierarchical world outlook, it couldn't understand the brutal pragmatism of Western imperialism. The Qing leadership saw the British as insolent barbarians with no respect for order or decorum, while to the British, the Qing represented the crumbling relic of a very ancient past. Thus, misunderstanding and distrust fanned the flames, so neither was going to escape unscathed in this conflict. By 1842, this war had finally reached its gruesome end. The Treaty of Nanking was signed that same year, which gave an end to hostilities and thus ended an extremely bitter, humiliating peace. Under the terms, China was bound to cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain, open 5 major ports to British trade, and pay the huge indemnity to cover all the expenses borne by Britain on account of its war. Worst of all, British citizens in China were given extraterritorial rights, placing them beyond Chinese law. These concessions not only weakened China's sovereignty, but also set the pattern for future exploitation by Western powers. It was more than a mere legal document, but a blueprint for imperial domination. The opium trade, notwithstanding the treaty, continued unabated now, cloaked by Britain's newfound influence in China. The social decline brought about by the opium addiction deepened, and the already fragile Qing dynasty was at an edge where collapse was imminent. Poverty, despair, and general resentment against foreign powers instigated rebellion that simmered in the countryside, which later built up into the Taiping Rebellion, a destructive civil war that would take the lives of millions more and further weaken the empire. While Britain was celebrating its triumph and the extension of its most liberal empire, it had managed to ignore or brush aside the human cost of its actions. History seldom offers tidy endings. Little less than 20 years after that first conflict, tensions flared once more, firing the starting gun on the Second Opium War in 1856, this time with Britain allied with another imperial power, France, which had ambitions in China. The former had taken the Qing government hostage, along with other foreigners, compelling their government to yield to still further concessions by force. The war continued to escalate with shocking brutality, culminating in the looting and destruction of the old summer palace in Beijing. The complex of consummate cultural artifacts and architectural marvels was reduced to ashes in a most barbaric act that sent shockwaves even among some of the victors. By the end of this war in 1860, what was left of China's sovereignty had been further worn away, placing the once mighty empire in a state of profound vulnerability. The Opium Wars had great and long-lasting repercussions. For China, they represented the start of what would later be called the Century of Humiliation, a period of being at the mercy of foreign powers, civil wars, and systemic retreat. The weakened and discredited Qing dynasty struggled to maintain any semblance of control as rebellion and reform movements ripped through the country. For Britain, The wars had shown the reach of industrial and naval supremacy, yet left a moral legacy of compromise and exploitation. And yet, even within this grim chapter of history, there was an occasional glint of resilience, even hope. The figures, Lin Zexu in particular, stand as giants against unbelievable odds for his homeland, attesting to what the human heart and principle are capable of. The Chinese people, despite enduring immense suffering, would ultimately rise from the ashes of this era, forging a path toward modernization and reclaiming their sovereignty on their own terms. The Opium Wars are that part of the painful yet integral part of our common past, holding valuable lessons concerning the nature of ungovernable greed, ambiguous cultural exchange, and the eternal struggle for justice and sovereignty. As we drink our morning tea, a commodity once at the heart of this stormy story, we could reflect on that extraordinary journey to get it in our cups, a journey of ambition, conflict, and resilience.